Good morning to everybody, and thanks to all the organizers and the collaborators for the amazing work putting this together. I would love to be here all live with you, and it's a pleasure to be facilitating this panel with my colleagues about this important topic, which is bridging the psychedelic experience into real life changes and real transformations. So I want to first invite Francoise sharing about her experience of facilitating the integration and sharing a little bit what you consider most important with regards to the integration of psychedelic.
Thank you. What a pleasure being here. I wish we were all together in Vancouver, but maybe Nir wouldn't be here. So I'm glad we're on Zoom just for Nir. Half my family is in Israel, so I'm happy to be with you here. So I have been involved in this work with psychedelic for over 30 years. And started in the Bay Area, San Francisco, in the mid 80s, and continued on to connect with the Mazatec tradition of Mexico and the use of sacred mushrooms there. And through my work as a counselor and as a person helping prepare and integrate those experiences, as well as taking hundreds of people down to Mexico to experience the work there and support people through their process, I have, sort of drafted or understood what I think integration is. And I know we all have a different versions, which is really interesting to exchange here. And but I have a kind of a crusade for my integration banner, because I feel that that's really where the main reason why people come to psychedelics is not so much or exclusively to have a deep experience and to have something that touches their soul and spirit, but it's really a lot for healing as well, or to be inspired, or to live a life that is infused with creativity and love and relationship and participation to the society in which we live, and the good impact they can have for the planet. And I feel like people really want to change their lives. They really want to have something that makes a difference in their ongoing process, not just to have a fantastic moment. And so as a counselor, a lot of people come to me because they have, they're stuck, they have human afflictions like depression, anxiety, relational issues, lack of creativity in their professional life, lack of meaning, flatness in their spiritual concept or experience. And so they come to me with a wanting something more. And so what I support in integration, I call integration, the three words, I call it connecting, noticing, and cultivating. This is how I see integration. So of course there is a set and setting and the intention that people are articulating before going into an experience. And so then my work in supporting their integration process is to help them connect the dots. What was like making meanings? Why did you have that experience? Why did you see the cosmos? Why did you go into your difficult relationship with your father? Why did you remember yourself as a child? Why did you become a tree? What is the answer to your intention with that experience? So connecting the dots for me is the first aspect of what integration is, which is the connection with the narrative of the journey with the intention that was set beforehand. So that's the first aspect of integration. And for me, the second aspect of integration is noticing. I really encourage people to notice what they feel after the experience. What is I call it gathering evidence. What is the way in which their life is affected, and tracking those details. Sometimes they're huge moments of connecting with their mother they haven't talked to for 3 years, or sometimes it's just drinking a little less coffee in the morning. It can be a variety of differences, but for people to shine consciousness, awareness, like reflecting on how different their life is the second piece of integration. Like really taking stock of how this transformation starts to take place, starts to show up sort of instinctively without them doing anything about it, just like the transformation is landing in those territories. And I use the holistic model, which is something I talk a lot in my book, which is looking at life through the body, the emotional mind, the spiritual, the community, and the environment. So if people look through these lenses of these five aspects, they can track what takes place on each of these aspects. And tracking, really making lists, I have them do a journey journal, I called it. So they can actually take notes every day or twice a week or once a week about the actual transformations that takes place on these different aspects. And finally, what I find it possibly the most engaging for them and the most participatory is to have them cultivating these transformations. So, everything that has happened in the journey and everything that they're noticing after is sort of a more receptive, passive moment, right? They're just noticing and they're just kind of on the afterglow. But what is really engaging, and that's really important to me, to have them, you know, uh, take actions to what is it that has happened and how to best support the ongoing unfolding and stabilizing, in Hakomi we call physicalizing, right? Physicalizing, concretizing, actually engaging with what has started to take place instinctively. So they follow their own impulse, they follow their own lead, and they continue on that track, right? So if a track leads to, oh, I'm reconnecting with my mother I haven't talked to, this is something that came to me. Well, who else do I want to connect with? Who else do I want to mend my relationship in? So then they start to proactively look at the direction that has been, initiated by this instinctive direction. And then if they are changing something in the diet, right, on the body aspect, if they're noticing, oh, I feel different, I want to move differently, I feel more released, my body has opened up, I feel more vitality. How am I going to cultivate that? So instead of, oh, I feel more vitality and I don't do anything with it, we're gonna create together what I call integration practices, where they're going to be engaging themselves to, okay, what would that look like for you to eat differently, sleep differently, move differently? What would that look like actually? And to engage in practices that they can sustain, that they feel good about, that they feel they can continue on and create essentially a new baseline from which they're going to continue their life. So for me, the integration is really both a process of noticing and being really receptive and a process of action and engaging. And I like to create a really collaborative work with the people that I've taken to Mexico and continue, or people who do work and out there, on their own, and then come to me for integration. A lot of people have come, going to South America or going to do work with, or experiences with friends, and then they come to have integration because they know there's a process that is sort of organized and pretty well put together that will support their transformation. And this new baseline, this new, how the mind actually manifest and absorbs and integrate the changes. How do we learn new patterns after repetition of a certain level? Then that becomes the new normal, right? I mean, I had this guy once who, we came back from a trip, and he was saying, I'm really feeling different and I'm really engaging differently. And now I don't remember who I was before. This is the new normal now. I am really coming from a base that is very different from where I came from 2 months ago. And I said, yeah, this is the new normal. This is the new normal. And from here, you can keep expanding, I mean, if you wish, and you can keep following this track of your openings and of your transformation. So, in Mexico, it's interesting when I talk to the Mazatecs there, they don't talk about a journey as a journey. They call it a transformation. I mean, they call it transformación. They really call it a word. They don't call it a trip, an experience, a work, or your healing. They call it a transformation. And so it's very interesting to see that they consider that really the transformative process from which you don't come back the same. And so my work with them, with people who go through these processes, is really to support that transformation and make it be real in their lives. So it's not just, a bubble of a fabulous experience that they've had, Now it's different, I guess, for you near, when you're in festivals and you help, like the Zendo in Burning Man, which I've worked at myself. And, you don't have the capacity to offer these kinds of ongoing transformative process. And so that's that, we of course, this is a different setup. But when there is the capacity for people to seek a counselor or someone who has been educated in this art of integration, I think it's really valuable to then pursue, right, the process of what this wild experience has been about. Even if it's really crazy and wild and has been scary and destabilizing, there's still merit in looking at what this opened for them. So yeah, so this is what I can say right now, and we'll see what the Q&A open up. But thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing to us your experience in this way. And like to pass over the word to Niels to share about his perspective on integration, what you consider most relevant to share about your experience with all the integration work.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here and honored to be in this panel. And I want to share my perspective on the integration process from different parts of my work. So in general, I would say that I see the psychedelic integration process as the process by which we make meaning out of our psychedelic experiences. And for that to happen, for us to make meaning out of this experience, we have to first construct a coherent narrative of the experience. And this is something that often happens naturally, and you emerge out of the experience while you hold this narrative, you understand the experience you went through, you remember the meaningful parts of it. And sometimes, like many people we support in parties and festivals, you have no idea what happened. Sometimes you didn't even choose to take the substance. So the first stage of integration, I would say, will be to construct this coherent narrative. And once we constructed this coherent narrative, we can start engaging with the different parts of the experience, the different dimensions of experience, the physical, the emotional, the mental, the interpersonal, the spiritual. And once we engage with these different dimensions of the experience, we can start implementing these insights and this new knowledge into our day-to-day life. And I will say that regarding the psychedelic harm reduction work that we're doing, I will say that the most important part for the first steps of integration, I would probably say it will be safe space. It will be a sense of safety we want to nourish in our guests, and also loving presence. And this sense of safety and loving presence, I would say, will be the most crucial necessities for the very first steps of integration, for the person to be able to construct a narrative, to be able to be safe enough to look inside and see what he or she went through. And the second stage of integration will be our engagement with these different dimensions of the experience and the way we implement this new knowledge into our day-to-day life. And this is something I've been doing for the last 2 years in my private practice. And all I can say is that mindfulness-based approaches like Hakomi are very supportive and very beneficial for this shift between a non-ordinary state and the ordinary state of consciousness. And the third stage of integration, as far as I see it, and this is something that emerged while I was working on my master's thesis, is what I termed during this thesis meta-integration, the psychedelic meta-integration process. And basically what happened is that I started interviewing mental health professionals about how they engage with the psychedelic integration process during their own day-to-day life, how it impacted their personality, their daily life, their practice as psychotherapists. And after I started interviewing, I realized that they were answering my questions. While they were answering my questions, they were referring to psychedelic experiences that took place over 20 years or more, sometimes experiences that took place in different periods of their life, in different settings, using different substances. And this is why I term this psychedelic meta-integration process as the larger integration process one go through that contains these different smaller psychedelic integration processes we go through after each experience. And I just want to quickly share with you one slide from the presentation I initially made for this conference. And this is basically the map of themes and codes that emerged from these 8 interviews that I studied for my master's. So one second, I will share the screen. Okay, so I hope you can all see it now. And you can see that at the center, we have the psychedelic meta-integration process, and there are lines connecting it to assimilation into personal life, which is a themes that contain different codes like family, somatic experiences, nature, letting go, and acceptance. And then we have psychospiritual development, which contain different codes. We have integration practices, which are the different practices that the mental health professionals I interviewed used in order to go deeper and to implement their psychedelic insights or their insights from their psychedelic experiences into their lives. So you can see it includes time in nature, journaling, singing, peer support, yoga, meditation, playing music, dancing, painting or drawing, engaging with symbols and archetypes that emerge during the process, and of course, therapy. And we also have ontological changes, which I think are maybe the most interesting part of this meta-integration process. And I called it ontological changes because the participants described a change to their very way of being. And I included spirituality as a sub-theme of this ontological changes because the transformation they went through spiritually, of course, completely changed the way of being, their way of being in the world. And of course, there is assimilation into the clinic, and participants described how it affected their practice. And I will just say one word. We don't have much time, so I will just say one word because there are many therapists in the crowd. And I will say that if I have to summarize in one sentence the change, the transformation that they described in their clinic during their professional work, it will be letting go. All of them described being able to let go as a therapist, being able to trust the process more and let go more in the clinic and just flow with the present moment and with what emerges from their clients' experiences. So that's about it, about the psychedelic integration process. And of course, we will continue this discussion in the Q&A. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so very much for sharing. And it's great to have those maps, right? To get like a visual design of all those spaces of integration in some way. And I want to pass the word now to Cody to share about your work with integration, your experience, and those parts that you consider most important to achieve an integrative process.
Beautiful, thank you. And really honored to be here and participate in the panel. And you know, Francoise and Nir already described the integration process so beautifully, but what I want to add here is just my own take in terms of the different dimensions of integration. And so, you know, both Francoise and Nir alluded to, you know, these sort of physical, behavioral changes we can make, spiritual changes, emotional, mental changes. And what I want to offer here is an attempt to define integration in a way that's actually expansive and constructive. rather than reductive. Because what I find, the more I learn about integration and go through my own integration process with myself and with my clients, is that we can't really separate integration from life. And life is ongoing and dynamic, and we're always in this conversation with life. So for me, integration is really like a way of actively responding to the question that is life. And the one dimension I want to attempt to focus on here in my explanation is this sort of psycho-spiritual dimension, or we could even just say psychological dimension on the level of ego. And so I think in order to understand integration for me, we also have to understand the process of disintegration, and what it is that we're integrating and what it is that has been disintegrated. And so one um, lineage that really heavily informs my work is the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition. And in that tradition, there's a term, basic goodness, which just essentially describes our fundamental nature, the fundamental ground of being and reality. And many people who've taken psychedelics, by good fortune and grace, touch this space and get a felt experience of it. So it's something that's much easier to experience than it is to describe, but it's essentially the realization that we're okay and we're whole. And this is, for most of us, the way we come into the world, notwithstanding intergenerational trauma and birth trauma. But as a child, if you look at a young child, there's a sense of innocence and there's a sense of wholeness. And the disintegration process that tends to occur for just about everyone throughout life is reactions to trauma, or we could say simply a reaction to an experience of not being loved or feeling separate. And so in that sense, these different parts of ourself begin to emerge. So there's a fragmentation of self. And in certain situations, we may default to our protector, or our inner child may feel really hurt and scared and wounded. And so internal family systems is a great model for this, that refers to these different archetypal parts of self. And what I find in psychedelic journeys is these parts quite naturally emerge in the psychedelic experience as we begin to get space from ourselves and begin to identify with these parts and then integrate these parts. And so big picture, what I see for integration is that my primary goal in working with anyone is to help them touch that space of basic goodness and remind them of who they really are. And that's a sense of innocence. And so if we can return someone to that place, we want to integrate that innocence with wisdom, which is, what all of these other parts are about. So rather than, there's this sort of very violent description of psychedelic work that I see in a lot of circles of oh, I need to purge, or I need to kill my ego, or I need to shed some part of myself. And my stance is very much that we need to incorporate and greet and welcome these parts of self with a sense of gratitude and holding them in their right place. So it becomes a question of how we identify and who we identify with, rather than identifying with the specific part that is usually in some state of fight or flight because it's a trauma response. We can begin to have an awareness of space and have an awareness of ourself outside of these specific parts, and really act responsively to life rather than reactively. And so ultimately, integration I see as a circle or a spiral. So I use the Lakota medicine wheel to describe the integration process as something that repeats and that we're never done. There's no point of arrival. There's no box to check. It's not as if I did this thing and now I've completed integration. What I would say finally is I think there's two kind of maybe three signs of someone reaching a state of integration. One is being open to disconfirmation. And so literally meaning that I'm open to receiving new information about myself and about who I am in the world that actually goes against, my former attempts to create a solid sense of identity. And so I'm open to new information. Another trait I think of somebody who's living in an integrated way is a sense of compassion, which just tends to naturally arise from that space of touching that basic goodness. And then finally, I would say my hope for myself and for others is that the ultimate act of integration is to be of service. And really what these medicines and these plants and these experiences are calling us towards is that we each have a unique gift to offer. In the same way that each cell in the body or each organ or each plant on this planet, every part of it belongs to this greater ecology. So too do we have a really authentic and genuine and unique role to play in this greater unfolding of the much larger space of community that we're participating in. And so that's, my ultimate goal is to bring people to a place of being able and ready and willing to be of service. So thank you, and excited to hear some questions.
And thank you so much, Cody, for bringing this complementary perspective of how to deal with those more difficult parts in integrative experience. And that will be my first questions to all of you, because certainly blissful and mystical experience oftentimes are much more easy for people to integrate because they have their own resources. But maybe sharing a little more of concrete tools about integrating really challenging experiences, maybe even traumatic experience, re-traumatizing experience in psychedelic. Maybe all of you could share a little bit about this and start to have a conversation about this.
I'll take a stab at it. I feel like if the experience happens with a safe and loving support, I feel like whatever trauma may be revealed or made more conscious of can be really transformed, or rather circulated through the body, through the emotional body, through the spiritual body, the relational body, of course. Finding support in a place of despair and high stress can be transformative, really reparative, and really healing. So within that context, I think that I feel like trauma is, in fact, helped. Okay, it's a big word for a complex process. It's a small word for a complex process. But if the experience takes place, let's say in a festival, right? I mean, there's not a lot of someone takes, acid on the playa in Burning Man and is transported into a repressed memory. There's a lot more damage there. There's a lot more complication to a recapitulation of trauma, of being overwhelmed, of being left alone, of being, intensely dealing with feelings or physical experiences that can be really hard to find support for. And so then there is a process of bringing the person back together through a lot of groundedness and stabilization and soothing. So, of course, the different context have a lot to do with how the trauma gets revealed or how to deal with this. And then there is this possibility of the trauma being evoked in an experience. And I feel like then if it's but if it starts to be evoked with a certain uncertainty, then there may be value to doing, again, in very safe environment, doing breath work, doing some intelligent and safe body work, or doing some ongoing releasing and sort of activating the body to continue the process, right? So it can continue that start of the circulation, expression, voice, things like this that can sort of continue that process. Now, if the sometimes I've had this myself, where there is something that emerges that's really difficult, but then there is a sort of an arc and there is a completion within the experience, and I'm sort of landing in a more compassionate, accepting place of my process, then, or even a compassion for the person who has hurt me, then there is a different integration process that can be more consisting of warm bath, or walk in nature, or soothing, or more mediative dialogue with the person, or loving kindness practice, so meditative practice that can then support the completion and the resolution of this trauma if it has been in a completion of its arc. So that's how I would differentiate different context and different state of the trauma resolution within an experience.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely resonate with what Francoise said, and I want to maybe focus more about my expertise, I would say, in festivals and parties and working with people who went into a psychedelic experience, sometimes in the worst setting imaginable. And then I would say that, as I said before, that the sense of safety and loving presence will be the utmost crucial necessities that we want to uh, nurture the person with. And people who want to engage with a psychotherapeutic process, that they want to work on the traumatic content that maybe came up. And what something we meet a lot, unfortunately, in parties and festivals in Israel is traumas from the military, army traumas that are coming up for sometimes soldiers that are going to these parties in the weekend when they're off the base. And then sometimes we have people who are confronting the most painful traumas we can imagine. And it's the first time they ever share this with anyone in a festival, in a party, while they're tripping. Yeah, they went to the army psychiatrist one and he told them, you're okay, you'll be fine. They talked a bit and they didn't go. The army, unfortunately in Israel, does not provide psychotherapeutic services. And then we meet a lot of it. Sometimes it's more minor and sometimes it's very major traumas. And then we definitely recommend the person to go to a psychotherapist who's an expert in trauma work. And we definitely do not do this psychotherapy ourselves, as we met these people in a non-ordinary state and we will not continue to a psychotherapeutic process with them. But we definitely refer them to someone who is an expert. And we got a feedback that people said that without having us to do the initial processing with, they would be kind of lost on how to describe the experience they went through to this therapist. Sometimes we're lucky enough to be able to connect the person with a therapist who knows the psychedelic world, but sometimes not. And then it's very important for them that we will help them establish a language, because there is a language that we can use, and definitely language that therapists can use. And soldiers often do not have these terminology and this kind of complex language you need to describe your experience. So I will say that, establishing a language with which you can describe your experience, if we're focusing on the harm reduction aspect of integration, and of course giving a sense of safety and loving presence in which the person can shift back to his ordinary state. It will definitely support his longer term psychospiritual well-being, I would say, these very first hours of integration.
Beautiful answers. And what I'll add is, speaking of that sense of safety, near that the ability to integrate difficult experiences really starts in the preparation phase of psychotherapy. And so for me, that's just primarily focused on relationship. And how do we build a safe, loving container so that when, not if, difficult experiences arise, we have the ability to hold these experiences because there's a sense of trust and attunement and safety there. And then the other piece I would add here is that, my emphasis is primarily somatic psychotherapy. And so I find meeting difficult experiences on the level of the body is really the most useful way to begin to integrate these experiences. I think it was Bessel van der Kolk, I'm not sure who said exactly that if we convince the body that it's over, then it's finally over. And so this sense that we're responding not to something present, but to something past that's still alive in the body, and that we really just need to learn both the skills and have the capacity to greet these difficult experiences rather than be in resistance to them. So I find that it is the resistance or the fear around difficult experiences that tends to perpetuate them. And that if we can move someone to a state of being in that difficult experience, allowing for the full intensity of it, not running from it, not trying to cope with it or minimize it, but really just being with it, there's a sense of completion. And then hopefully at the end of that experience, we can provide the experience that they wanted to have in the first place, which is generally safety, attachment, love, attunement. So difficult experiences, in my opinion, are welcome and helpful part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So enriching, getting those different perspectives from those different parts of experiences. Um, when I come up with another question, like being in this bridge in between indigenous traditions with psychedelic and the modern Occidental vision about psychedelics, actually the integration is more an Occidental part. There's traditions in the Amazon and in the Santo Daime where there's even held that it's not not useful always to talk about those experiences because they are so sacred and so deep that they cannot be grasped in words, that we need to leave them in their wholeness in order to unfold in their own due time. So I would like to ask you a little bit about this. There's this fine bridge, right, in between helping people to move through a process that is not completed, and on the other hand, treating maybe a psychedelic experience as dreams that have own power on the self that need to be left there to unfold. So just wanting to have your opinions on this question.
I'll start. In my, it's a theme that I've been very much working on with, in all my over 20 years of work with the Mexican tradition and how people deal with mushroom experiences there, and my angle as a Western counselor and how to bring the two together. And that's be the topic of my talk later today, actually, bridging the worlds of those indigenous wisdom and more Western psychology, which are both very, of course, valid and important. And I hear what you're saying, Anya, that the Mazatec really consider a journey, a mystery, an opening that has to be left in the inner chamber of the person who journeys, and really treated so sacredly that only that person can really listen and feel and know what it means to them. And that anybody outside is really an interpreter and not however attuned the person can be. And I agree with you, Cody, very much on the level of safety and attunement. And yet, how much really can we attune to someone's very, very private and intimate experience? So, we try, right? We try to connect and we try to help. So what I've observed in the Mazatec practices is that their capacity to stay with the listening of the experience is a lot more developed than in the Western world, where we go very quickly for meaning and we go very quickly for interpretation. And even what I was saying earlier, connecting the dot between why did you have this experience? They don't ask the why, they just stay with the it. So they don't try to figure it out how it serves them. They just trust it serves them. So there's that very solid faith in the magic of what the mushroom continues to doctor in them. And they will feel different, and they trust that they will feel different. And so the second part of what I was talking about, the noticing, is really where it's at for them. So they will notice, they will very reflective to how their life feels after the experience. That's really how their forte lies. And that's very important, right? To the power of awareness into one's again, transformation, as they call it, right? That's what they track. They track the transformation. What is being transformed and who am I? And it's very private. There's very little dialogue about it. They have a lot of practices as far as food and herbal treatments and various rituals of gratitude and offering to the spirit of the land on which they live. And there are rituals that take place as an integration practice. A lot of gratitude ritual and a lot of saying grace and saying thank you to the spirits and the saints of the Guadalupe or whoever helped them, or the ancestors that protected them and inspired them. So there's a lot of that, which I think is a very meaningful, very private, but very meaningful way of of staying with their process in an integrative way that we don't see maybe quite as valuable because we have a therapeutic angle. But the sacredness of it and the self-observation is really very touching and very meaningful. And I think we can learn from that a bit, as we are so angled into Western therapy.
Thank you, Francoise. Nir or Cody, do you want to say anything about this topic?
Sure, I'll say just a brief statement here on the role of story. And, really in what I hear you asking about is to what extent do we share what's happened, and is that a valid part of the healing journey? And certainly some of the indigenous elders that I've learned from and studied with, in Vision Quest and in ceremony, give very specific instructions that you hold this close to your heart and you don't share it, at least until you're ready, so that it can work on you. And as a somatic therapist too, I'm constantly walking that line between like, well, what is the importance of narrative and meaning versus just if we can heal this in the body and really bring the body to that place of completion and safety, doesn't really matter what the story is. And for me, the place I've kind of arrived is like this sense of looking to some of these indigenous cultures as models, that many of them are actually oral traditions, and that this wisdom is passed down through story. And so there clearly is some value and some benefit in telling the story. And what I would say is that, like, can you tell it in an integrated way? So there's a difference when you're listening to somebody who's still working through a trauma response or still working through something that is a wound or incomplete, versus somebody who's telling that story in an empowered way and passing on that wisdom from a place of embodiment, meaning they've really lived the lesson in their life. They haven't just received it cognitively. And so the one distinction I make there is, like, tell the story, but maybe wait until you can do it in a way that actually empowers you and empowers other people who hear that story too.
Thank you, Cody.
Hi, Anya. I'm going to interrupt here. Let's have a round of applause for this panel, hey? And I think this will kind of be how it goes for the rest of the forum. We're just going to make sure that we do have plenty of time for questions from the room and from online. So that's where we're at right now. That was an excellent panel. I'm sure there are questions. If there are, you can raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you, or you can come up. It looks like our friend Ellie.
Thanks for the great presentation so far and the panel right now. I'm just curious about what's happening in Israel. Of course, there's lots of political views we could take. I'm discouraged by what's happening there, but I'm curious about the soldiers you speak of who do the psychedelic therapy or do this at a party and try to integrate what they've experienced. And I'm just curious about the experience of living in a war zone or in an environment where you're in a hostile condition and you do the therapy, but you're back into the environment that supports that kind of trauma. And I'm curious about the benefit of doing psychedelics in that kind of environment where you have these amazing insights and healing processes, but then you're thrust back out into the system that supports that ongoing trauma. And I'm curious if you have any experience in this kind of work. I know that there's work going on with MAPS in Israel, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I will say that I am not deeply acquainted with the PTSD research that is done through MAPS in Israel. Of course, I know people who participated. I was even a night attendant in the research, so I was there. But I will say that I prefer to focus on this issue that you referred to of what I call, or there's an Israeli researcher called Ido Hartogzon, and he termed this, he called it cultural set and setting. And basically, we're all living inside a cultural set and setting beyond, like our collective set and setting in Israel is infused with trauma and with everything that is happening right now and with everything that is happening on the longer time scale since World War II onwards. And I will say that all of these collective experiences are something that we meet in the psychedelic harm reduction spaces that we have. So one thing I want to say about it is that I am sure that many experiences that emerge in our psychedelic harm reduction spaces in a way are best supported in Israel by people who can relate to these experiences, and often receiving support outside of Israel for these sort of traumas and these sort of sharings that come up during a difficult psychedelic experiences. I find it very important that they will be met with understanding. And many of these soldiers are in a way holding this dual personality, I will say. And one personality is the one that believes in freedom and believes in love and believes in free will and believes in the equality of all people. Yeah. And of course, as soldiers, they have to go back for at least between Sunday and Thursday, they will have to go back to wear a different persona that has kind of a different beliefs on the surface. And I can't say much about this transition besides it being very difficult and very painful and something that takes years and years and years after the army to integrate or to heal. And many of the soldiers are going to a few months or a few years of a journey around the world after the army. And often this is the first time that they're meeting psychedelics. And there is, I will say, a whole field in Israel of supporting soldiers that had a very challenging psychedelic experience in while they traveled overseas. And then many of them are coming back to Israel, sometimes even in a psychotic state. And this is not necessarily related to psychedelic, like classic psychedelics. Sometimes it's just marijuana and weed. But this will to alter your state of consciousness and to explore the consciousness beyond the very confined limits of what they dictated to you during these 3 years is something that we all go through. And I think that's all I can say about it in this time frame. Thank you for the question.
Beautiful, great answer, thank you. Any other questions in the room before we go online? Yeah.
I'd like you to visualize a situation and give me your input on how you might handle it. There are a number of groups that I've been with where no one there is a professional in psychotherapy. So if you imagine you're walking into a room and you see 6 to 12 people sitting around in a circle and they're describing their psychedelic experiences, and you can tell that nobody really knows how to do integration. They haven't really thought about it. They're just getting together and talking about what's happened to them. Given that not everybody can have your experience and training, either at psychotherapy outright or with psychedelic integration in some form, but you're dealing with kind of a grassroots situation where, and this could be a model for the future, where many more people are getting involved with psychedelics and integration. How would you advise the person or people running those small group sessions, simple things that they could do without needing to get a master's degree in counseling or something like that?
Well, I can share a couple of thoughts. I think one of the main ingredients is no comments, not making comments, just a compassionate, attentive listening. Maybe there can be some guidelines shared at the beginning of the sharing circle. We call them sharing circles. They're not really, I mean, they're integrative in a sense of putting words sometimes when one is ready, can be really fruitful. So naming, sharing, being heard by other people, and finding the words to express one's experience can be very powerful and very integrative. When someone feels heard, this means a lot. Revealing the secrets or the very deep facets of this experience or this vision or this felt sense can be very vulnerable. And exposing one's vulnerability in a circle when one is heard with attentive and compassionate listening, without comments, without interpretation, can be really supportive and creating a collective, a bond by virtue of exposing or sharing vulnerable places within a collective where everybody does the same thing. So I think that the no comments, listening, no checking your cell phone, being really attentive. If someone feels, a little vulnerable and cry, maybe the person next put a hand on their back, if that's okay, with permission, of course, something like that. No interpretation. That's what I would counsel on that. But those circles are meaningful. Those circles are very meaningful. So I wouldn't minimize their importance and what they provide for people.
Thanks, Francoise. And Mercedes, are you tuning in online there? Do you have any questions from our virtual audience?
Yes, I do. Okay, quite a few. The first one that's gotten the most votes so far: how do you create safety for people from intersectionally marginalized backgrounds, for example, Palestinians? Perhaps I missed this detail, but can Palestinians even access such therapies?
So I will say that there is no reason Palestinian, like, I understand this question is pointed towards me, but I will say that Palestinians, of course, can join the PTSD research with MAPS, as far as I understand, at least, not because I take decisions in this manner, but as far as I understand. And of course, there are some professional underground practices which they can access, and I can hardly say that I recognize, at least now, any major difference in facilitating a sense of safety for someone from this community or that community. I feel that the actual safe space that is needed requires very, very basic human, compassionate approaches that I cannot see different in any way, if it will be for this nationality, this community, or that. So I think that's all I can say for now about that. Yeah.
Thank you. Mercedes.
Thank you, Nir. This one comes from Jude Wong. One of the threads of this conversation early on was about embracing the disowned parts of the ego in order to then surrender it. Integration of those parts as opposed to talking about it in terms of a death. Jude would love to hear the three of you speak to the role of trauma that plays, the role that trauma plays in ego surrender.
I'll jump in here and hopefully pick up a few threads we've been talking about. So the most basic understanding of trauma, right, is an experience of being overwhelmed and not having choice and inescapability. And so, the primary role that trauma creates in, I would say, creating a barrier to that ego surrender is the posture of defensiveness and protection. And so, what we might attempt to do through psychotherapy is to soften that sense of protection. But what I'm hearing, in Claudia Ford's talk this morning and in some of these questions about Israel and Palestine is this question of safety and how do we work with someone who might still exist in a traumatized field? So in essence, like, are we working with someone who's actively in the war zone? And if we are, then is it going to serve them to deactivate these defenses that might actually be quite functional and quite responsive and helpful in their current environment? And, you know, the one piece as I'm listening to all of this that I want to add is more of, you know, what I would say is a Buddhist perspective, that we're all fundamentally unsafe. And, you know, regardless of race or country or where you live, that the situation we're in is intensely vulnerable, just being a human being. And that I'm going to contradict myself here, and that one of the primary goals of psychotherapy is safety, but at the same time, how do we begin to help someone be with the inherent instability and unsafety of being human? And so I think that's something that we all share, and we're all traumatized in that sense. And so there's a greater task in psychedelic work to open up to that very, you know, basic and primal fear and sense of unsafety.
I'll piggyback on what you say, Cody, because it's I totally agree with you. And at the same time, I have found that ultimately psychedelic really lead people into the ultimate safety of the soul, of the oneness with what is beyond human incarnation, almost, you know, the world of spirit, where we all exist as a unity consciousness, as a transcendent space, which is incarnated, which that's where the complication starts to happen in the embodiment of that spirit world. So I feel like in titrating very carefully the amount of psychedelic that is given to someone to actually learn and learn to know those barriers and defenses, this protectiveness you were just describing, and understanding the function of these defenses, and then slowly sort of addressing them, not in the blasting, you know, melting, deconstructing, dissolving, but more like a softening of this ego protection to the place where there is ultimately, you know, the fear, and then beyond the fear, below the fear, there is the safety of the spirit world. And so I think that part of the precaution that we are invited to here, especially in trauma space, is to really not recapitulate trauma by creating an intensity that reminds people of a traumatic experience, but by really softening this field of protectiveness through all safety with the person who's sitting.
Great. We've got 4 minutes left on this panel. How about one more quick question from you, Mercedes?
Sure. From Adrienne Oberg. Hi, Adrienne. I'm curious how much you would attribute therapeutic outcomes to skillful integration. This is directed at everybody.
I would say that I would very much connect a beneficial psychedelic integration process that one consciously engages with the therapeutic process, or the benefits, the outcomes of the therapeutic process he or she engages with. And I don't have much to add beyond what I said about the importance of constructing a coherent narrative with which you can work. And I just want to give a note on that often I have people contacting me because of the psychedelic harm reduction that we do, people who are already inside a psychotherapeutic process, sometimes for many years, and they're not interested in having a new therapist and having a new ally for their life journey. They're interested in speaking to someone who is experienced in psychedelic integration work, and then take the insights that they had during these few sessions, let's say, and bring these into their existing psychotherapeutic process. So in that sense, I would say that the psychedelic integration process can be very beneficial if you bring it into a beneficial, larger psychotherapeutic process. And I think the therapeutic relationship that one has is the most important part, and bringing the insights from the psychedelic integration process into the main therapeutic relationship, I will say, will be the beneficial connection I would make.
Beautiful, thank you. Anya, I will leave this to you to wrap up your panel quickly here before we take a 15-minute break, both online and offline.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And just want to ask the three panelists a short conclusion sentence, like for people, really, what you want to add to what you have said. Like what is important you want to give them to take away.
I'll say what creates the most safety for participants in psychedelic processes and integration is the resonance that is between the journeyer and the guide or therapist. That as human beings, we're really offering our own personal experience in this psychedelic field that can serve not so much in identifying with the person's experience, but more the field of resonance of those spaces. And that creates a lot of safety and support.
Thank you, Francoise. Neer?
I think that's the only thing I will add is that I believe that each person should cultivate the ability to just be with the experience and with the different dimensions of experience and regard his firsthand direct contact with the experience he had as the most important part. And the, I would say interpretations, as Francoise said before, are usually not that beneficial. And just having a direct experience and being able to stay with the experience and observe the different dimensions of how this experience unfolds physically, emotionally, interpersonally, spiritually, I would say that's the core of it for me.
Thank you, Neer. Beautiful. Cody?
Yeah, in my short sentence here, I want to honor the late Don Howard. Yesterday was the anniversary of his transition, and the words that he always spoke in drinking and partaking in ceremony was "Para bien de todos," for the good of all.